Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm resuming a question I asked of the Minister actually the Minister for Fisheries answered the question, but it pertains to climate targets and climate accountability. And I made the point in question period that when we talk about climate targets, they aren't political. They are deeply about the science. The Minister of Fisheries replied at the time that the new targets that the Prime Minister had just announced on the Earth Day Summit with Joe Biden were in fact to be put into the law and actually reflect part of what's called the Net Zero Climate Accountability Act, C-12. Since then, the government decided not to put those targets in the act. The key point I want to make today in our adjournment proceedings is about the nature of what we committed to do under the Paris Agreement in 2015 at COP21. The key thing we committed to do was to work with all the other nations on Earth to hold global average temperature increase to no more than 1.5 degrees above what those levels were before the Industrial Revolution, and preferably, and certainly to hold them as far below 2 degrees as possible. So why does this matter? Well, the survival of human civilization is very much at risk if we miss these targets. Going to 1.5 degrees, we're now more than 1 degree Celsius global average temperature increase above where we were as a society, as a planet before the Industrial Revolution. Going above 1.5 degrees is actually not a safe zone, it's a danger zone. It involves a significant risk to human civilization's survival. Going above 2 degrees puts our future generations, our own children, very much at risk. That's why the targets are not political, they're about the science. I'm heartbroken that the government chose to put forward its so-called climate accountability legislation aiming for a level of reductions of emissions that are not tied to the science and actually put us at risk. The clamoring around C-12 and the title net zero by 2050 is the wrong target. Net zero by 2050 does not hold to 1.5 degrees. Net zero by 2050, in the words of Greta Thunberg, net zero by 2050 is surrender without short-term, near-term targets that ensure that emissions globally are cut in half by 2030. I've just this moment left clause by clause as it ends on C-12. The milestone year remains 2030. But the large problem remains that if we don't improve what we have agreed to do, the target referenced when I put this question forward in question period, the target of 40 to 45% below our 2005 levels by 2030 is not close to being what we committed to do in Paris. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change set forth what all countries on Earth have to do. Canada has a larger burden than most because we're the only country in the industrialized world to see our emissions go up so very much since 1990, go up since Paris. We have a commitment to do better, to do more, and that means that we should be revising our target upward, and we should not delude ourselves into believing that net zero by 2050 is anything other than a public relations gloss on what the science tells us we must do. We are in a climate emergency. We need to act like it. Ban fracking, cancel the TMX pipeline, and do those things in our power as an industrialized society that is wealthy to move to climate security.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Economic Development and Official Languages.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. Bill C-12 is a groundbreaking piece of legislation. Madam Speaker?
Yeah, we can't see you. We can't see the Honourable Member. Your camera is perhaps not turned to the right side of the... Aha. Sorry, there we go.
Sorry, Madam Speaker. Let me start. Madam Speaker, once again, Bill C-12 is a groundbreaking piece of legislation for Canada establishing a legal framework for Canada to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by the year 2050 and help the globe avoid the worst consequences of climate change. There are many years before 2050, and we know that our actions and emissions reductions in those intervening years are just as important as where we are in 2050. That is why, Madam Speaker, Bill C-12 requires the government to set emissions reduction targets at 5-year intervals starting in 2030, all the way until 2050, and it will also require the government to report on its progress towards achievement of those targets throughout. Of course, the requirement to develop emission reduction plans are also an important component of the legislation. With respect to a near-term target, a new provision was added during committee review to require the inclusion of an interim GHG emission objective for 2026. Adding an interim objective provides a midpoint check-in between now and 2030. 2026 objective will offer an opportunity to have a more detailed look in terms of whether we are still on track for 2030 or not, and do the course correction accordingly. Understandingly, Madam Speaker, that the previous emission reduction commitments made by signatories to the Paris Agreement are not enough to hold global warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius, there has been a global call for increased ambition and climate action. Canada heard this call, and in April, at the Leaders Summit on Climate, announced an enhanced emissions reduction target of 40 to 45% below 2005 levels by 2030. I am pleased to announce that because of amendments adopted by the House of Commons ENVI Committee, this target will be embedded directly in the text of the bill. Madam Speaker, to conclude, the measures contained in the Canadian Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act will ensure that there is a clear process in place for setting targets, as well as planning and reporting on progress, including in the key period between now and 2030. And finally, Madam Speaker, along with the reporting requirements under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Act will ensure that the Government of Canada is committed and accountable for all the years to come in charting Canada's path to net zero emissions by 2050. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Well, I'm disappointed to tell the Parliamentary Secretary that clause by clause did not embed those targets in the Act, although it had been promised. The reality is that net zero by 2050, if achieved, does not ensure that we are holding to 1.5 or even to as far below 2 degrees as possible. That is why Greta Thunberg has said clearly to the EU commissioners, quote, net zero by 2050 is surrender, unquote. There's only one pathway to holding to 1.5 degrees and as far below 2 degrees as possible. The IPCC set that out in its special report, October 2018, and that is more dramatic emissions reductions globally than anything yet anticipated. Canada should be cutting to 60% below our 2005 levels by 2030, not a mere 40. We must do better, we must do more, and we must stop lying to ourselves. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Well, Madam Speaker, our recently announced strengthened climate plan, A Healthy Environment and a Healthy Economy, builds on our first climate plan, the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change, and included over 60 new measures and $15 billion in investments to advance our ambitious climate goals and strengthen our clean economy. The government has since expanded on these investments and committed an additional $15 billion for public transit and active transportation projects, and a $17.6 billion in new green recovery measures in Budget 2021. The investments made in Budget 2021, Madam Speaker, along with other actions, including strengthened alignment with the United States to cut further pollution from transportation and methane emissions, mean that Canada is now positioned to reduce emissions by about 36% below 2005 levels by 2030. Thank you, Madam Speaker.